in a part of the city where the buildings stood too close together and the air always smelled faintly of diesel and wet asphalt, lived a young girl named Mira. Her world was not a quiet one. From the moment she woke up until the moment she fell asleep, she was surrounded by noise. There was the constant rumble of buses passing by on the street below, the shouting of neighbors arguing through thin walls, and the heavy bass of music coming from cars parked on the corner. Most people in her neighborhood learned to tune this chaos out. They learned to sleep through the sirens and talk over the roar of the traffic. But Mira was different. Mira heard everything as music. To her, the city wasn't just loud, it was a symphony that never stopped playing. She would sit at her small kitchen table, trying to finish her homework, but her attention would always drift to the window. She would hear the rhythmic clank-clank of the construction workers down the street, and in her head she would add a melody to it. A car horn would beep, 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 and she would instantly find that note on an imaginary scale. Even the sound of the rain hitting the metal fire escape outside her window wasn't just water falling. It was 1,000 tiny drummers playing a complex beat. She had a gift. A rare and natural ability to hear pitch and rhythm in places where other people only heard annoyance. However, having a musician's ear while living in silence was a cruel irony. Mira's family did not have much money. Her parents worked long hours at 2 different jobs just to keep food on the table and keep the lights on. There was certainly no extra money for things like piano lessons or sheet music. In their house, money was for rent, electricity, and groceries. Music was something that came out of the radio, not something you made yourself. Mira knew better than to ask for an instrument. She saw the worry lines on her mother's forehead every time the bills came in the mail. She knew that a piano, even a cheap one, cost more than her parents earned in months, so she kept her love for music a secret, locked away inside her own mind. She never told anyone how she would hum along to the birds in the morning, matching their pitch perfectly. She never told her friends that the reason she liked tapping her pencil on her desk at school wasn't because she was bored, but because she was practicing a rhythm she had heard that morning. She was afraid that if she told them, they would laugh at her. What good was a song you couldn't play? There was one place, however, where Mira allowed herself to dream. It was on her walk home from school. Down a busy street, past the fruit stand and the laundromat, there was a small, dusty shop that sold musical instruments. It was the kind of place that looked like it hadn't been cleaned in 20 years. The windows were covered in a thick layer of gray dust, making it hard to see inside. But every day, Mira would stop there. She would wipe away a small patch of the grime with her sleeve and press her face against the cold glass. Inside, standing in the center of the room, was a beautiful, polished, upright piano. It wasn't a grand concert piano, but to Mira, it was the most beautiful object in the world. It had a glossy black finish that reflected the streetlights, and she imagined that the keys must feel cool and smooth to the touch. Sometimes if the shop owner was inside, he would play. It was just faint, muffled by the glass, but Mira would stand there, frozen in place, listening to the notes drifting through the door. She would watch his hands move across the keys, dancing and jumping, and she would imagine her own hands there. She would close her eyes and pretend she was the one playing, that the music was flowing from her heart, through her fingers, and into the air. Those moments were both the best and the worst part of her day. They filled her with a sense of wonder and peace, but they also left her with a deep ache in her chest when she finally had to turn away and walk home to her empty, musicless apartment. She felt like a painter who could see colors in his mind but had no canvas, or a writer with 1,000,000 stories but no paper to write them on. The music was building up inside her, pressing against her ribs, desperate to get out. But she had no way to let it escape. Things changed on a rainy Tuesday afternoon in November. Mira was at school, sitting in the back of her history class, watching the rain streak against the window pane. The teacher, Mr. Henderson, had stepped out for a moment, leaving the class in a buzz of whispers and thrown paper balls. Mira, as usual, was humming softly to herself. She was harmonizing with the sound of the rain, creating a minor chord that felt sad but beautiful. She didn't realize she was doing it loudly until the door swung open. Mr. Henderson walked back in, but he wasn't alone. He was with the school's music teacher, a man named Mr. Vance, whom Mira had only seen from a distance. They stopped in the doorway, and the room went dead silent. Mr. Vance was looking around the room, his eyes squinting as if he were searching for something. Then his gaze landed on Mira. "You," Mr. Vance said, pointing a finger at her. "You were humming that B-flat minor chord, weren't you?" Mira froze. Her face turned hot with embarrassment. She sank lower in her chair, hoping the desk would swallow her whole. The other kids giggled. "I don't know," she stammered. "I was just humming." "It was perfect pitch," Mr. Vance said, ignoring the laughter of the other students. He walked down the aisle and stood right next to her desk. "The rain outside was hitting the glass in a rhythm, and you were matching the key. That is not something you can just do without training or without a very special ear." Mira looked up at him, her heart pounding in her chest. For the first time in her life, an adult was looking at her not as the quiet girl from the poor neighborhood, but as someone with value. She didn't know what to say, so she just nodded. Mr. Vance smiled, a genuine, warm smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "I have been looking for someone for the school choir," he said. "But I think you might be meant for something more than just singing. Do you play an instrument, Mira?" She shook her head slowly. "No, sir. We don't have. I can't." Mr. Vance looked at her worn-out shoes and her frayed uniform. He understood immediately. He saw the intelligence in her eyes and the talent in her voice. But he also saw the poverty that held her back. He didn't pity her. Instead, he looked determined. Mr. Vance said, turning back to Mr. Henderson. "I think we might have found our soloist for the spring recital. But first, we need to get our hands on some keys." As the bell rang and the students flooded out of the room, Mira stayed behind for a moment. She watched Mr. Vance talking to her history teacher, gesturing toward the music department down the hall. A small flicker of hope ignited inside her, burning bright and hot. Maybe, just maybe, her silent world was about to get loud. She didn't know that the help they were planning to find would come in the form of a broken, dusty instrument. But in that moment, it didn't matter. For the first time, someone had seen her. They had seen the music inside her, and they weren't going to let it stay hidden forever. She gathered her books and walked out of the classroom, her step a little lighter. Her head held a little higher, ready to see where this new path would lead. The days following the meeting with Mr. Vance felt like they were moving in slow motion for Mira. Every time the phone rang inside their small apartment, she would freeze, hoping it was the news she was waiting for. Her parents noticed the change in her. Usually, she was quiet and withdrawn, keeping to herself to avoid being a burden. But now there was a nervous energy about her. She was cleaning things that didn't need cleaning, pacing the small living room, and looking out the window more than usual. When she finally told them that the school might be able to get her a piano, her mother had tears in her eyes, and her father smiled a rare, tired smile. They didn't know how the school could afford it, but they believed in the kindness of strangers. A few days later, the phone call finally came. Mr. Vance's voice was filled with excitement on the other end of the line. He told Mira's father that they had found an instrument. It was being kept in an old storage basement of a high school that was being shut down and renovated. It was heavy and a bit dusty, he said, but it was a piano, and it was hers if she wanted it. Mira's father agreed immediately, thanking the teacher over and over again before hanging up. Mira felt a rush of pure joy. She didn't care if it was dusty. She didn't care if it was old. It was a piano. The next morning, a battered delivery truck pulled up in front of their apartment building. It was a Saturday, so the whole neighborhood was outside. Two large men got out of the truck, looking at the staircase of the apartment building with expressions of dread. They went to the back and opened the heavy doors. Mira stood on the sidewalk, her hands clasped together in excitement, waiting to see her future. But as they pulled the instrument out of the truck, her smile faltered just a little. It wasn't shiny or black. It was an upright piano, but it looked like it had been through a war. The wood was a dark, chipped mahogany that was peeling in places. It was missing one of its front legs, so it leaned awkwardly to the side. It was covered in a thick layer of gray grime, and cobwebs hung from the pedals. But Mira tried to push those thoughts away. She told herself that a little cleaning and some polish would fix the outside. What mattered was the inside. What mattered was that it could make sound. Getting the piano into the apartment was a nightmare. The building was old and didn't have an elevator, said the men had to maneuver the heavy beast up 3 flights of narrow, twisting stairs. Mira and her mother stood by the open door, wincing every time the men cursed or the wood of the banister scraped against the piano's side. The neighbors came out of their apartments to watch, some of them shaking their heads at the noise. By the time they shoved it through the front door and into the tiny living room, the delivery men were sweating heavily and breathing hard. "There you go, miss," one of them said, wiping his forehead with a rag. "It's all yours. Good luck getting it tuned, though. This thing looks like it hasn't been touched in 40 years. They left quickly, leaving the door open behind them to let out the smell of sweat and exertion. But as the air settled, a new smell began to fill the room. It was a musty, damp odor, like old wet cardboard and mildew. Mira stepped closer, her heart sinking. The piano took up almost half of the living space. It loomed over the small furniture like a giant dark monster. The sofa had to be pushed against the wall just to make room for the bench. Her mother clapped her hands together, trying to stay positive. "Oh, Mira, look at it. It's magnificent. We just need to give it a good wash, and it will look brand new. It's a miracle." Her father nodded, patting the top of the piano, sending a small cloud of dust into the air. A real piano. In our house. Who would have thought? Mira forced a smile. She walked over to the bench and sat down. It wobbled because one leg was shorter than the others. She reached out and pulled the keyboard cover up. The sound it made was a dry, screeching clack, like the sound of 2 branches breaking. Mira looked down at the keys, and her breath caught in her throat. They were terrible. The ivory was missing from most of the keys, leaving the yellowed wood underneath exposed. Some of the keys were chipped, looking like broken teeth. But the worst part was that they were uneven. They stuck up at odd angles, some high, some low. It looked like a mouth that had been in a bad fight. Mira took a deep breath and tried to ignore how it looked. She lifted her right hand, hovering her trembling fingers over the keys. She decided to play a simple C major scale, just to hear the tone. She pressed the middle C key. Nothing happened. She pressed it harder. The key went down, but it didn't make a sound. It just felt mushy and soft, like stepping on a wet sponge. She moved her finger to the D key. That one made a sound, a dull, hollow thud that sounded more like someone hitting a piece of wood with a spoon than a musical note. She tried the E key. It let out a screeching metallic buzz that made her pull her hand back. Mira looked up at her parents. They were still smiling, looking at the piano with pride. They didn't know much about music. They didn't know that a piano was supposed to sing, not thud and buzz. To them, this heavy, dusty piece of furniture was a symbol of success. It was proof that their daughter was special. Mira felt a lump form in her throat. She couldn't tell them it was broken. She couldn't tell them it was garbage. That would be ungrateful. It would break their hearts. "Play something for us, Mira," her mother said softly. Mira nodded. She turned back to the keys, her hands shaking. She tried to find the notes to a simple song she knew, a lullaby she used to hum to herself. She pressed a key. Thud. She pressed another. Buzz. A third key stuck down and refused to come back up, trapping her finger for a second before she pried it loose. The sounds that came out were jarring and ugly. There was no melody, only noise. It sounded like 2 cats fighting in an alleyway. Her father's smile faded a little. Is that how it is supposed to sound?" "It's out of tune," Mr. Vance said from the doorway. Mira hadn't heard him come in. He was standing there, holding a box of sheet music. He looked at the piano, and Mira saw a look of pity in his eyes that he tried to hide. He walked into the room, the floorboards creaking under his weight. "The school was going to throw this away," Mr. Vance explained gently to the parents. "The basement flooded a few years ago, and the water ruined the insides. The cost to fix it is very high. But I thought, even for a broken instrument, it is a place to start. She can learn the fingerings at least." Mira's mother looked worried. "Oh, but can she still learn? Can she become a musician on this?" "Music is in here," Mr. Vance said, tapping his temple. And in here, he added, tapping his chest. "The piano is just a tool. A bad tool makes for a better worker later on. It was a nice thought, but as Mira sat there in the silence that followed, staring at the chipped yellowing keys, she didn't feel like a worker. She felt like a victim. She pressed the middle C key again, feeling the dead resistance of the mechanism. It wasn't just out of tune. The hammers inside were probably warped from the dampness. The felt was likely rotting away. This wasn't an instrument. It was a corpse. That night, the apartment felt different. The piano sat in the corner like a dark shadow. It didn't look like a gift anymore. It looked like a mockery. Mira lay in her bed, listening to the city sounds outside. Usually the rhythm of the traffic comforted her, but tonight, the silence of the piano in the next room felt louder than the cars. She knew her parents had sacrificed space and comfort for this thing. She knew Mr. Vance had fought to get it for her. She wanted to love it. She wanted to believe what the teacher said, that she could overcome it. But as she closed her eyes, all she could see were the jagged keys and the missing leg. And all she could hear was that dull, disappointing thud. She had finally gotten her dream, but it felt like a cruel joke. They had given her the worst piano in the world, and she had no choice but to turn it into music. Or admit that her dream was over before it had even begun. For the first few weeks, having a piano in the apartment felt less like a blessing and more like a punishment. Every day after school, Mira would come home, drop her bag on the floor, and stare at the massive, dark beast taking up half the living room. It sat there, silent and imposing, gathering even more dust in the dim light. Her parents would smile at her encouragingly, nodding toward the bench as if to say, "Go on, make us proud." But Mira felt no pride, only a heavy sense of dread. She would sit down on the wobbly bench, place her fingers on the chipped keys and try to play. It was never music. It was always a fight. The middle C key was the worst offender. It was so sticky that Mira had to practically punch it to get it to move. And even then, the sound was a dull thunk instead of a clear note. The key right next to it, the DEA, was stuck permanently down, so if she wasn't careful, she would hit 2 notes at once by accident. The high notes at the top of the keyboard were so tight and rusted that her fingers would start to hurt. After just a few minutes of trying to press them down, it was like trying to play on a set of heavy iron levers rather than a musical instrument. Mira was trying to learn from an old, borrowed book Mr. Vance had given her. The pages were yellow and brittle, filled with simple songs like Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, and basic scales. But playing a C major scale on this piano was impossible. The notes didn't blend together. They clashed. One note would be too quiet, the next would be jarringly loud, and the third would buzz like an angry hornet. It sounded like a machine falling down a flight of stairs, not a melody. The frustration built up inside her, day after day. Mira was a girl with perfect pitch, which meant she could hear exactly how wrong every single note was. While a normal student might have been able to ignore the bad tuning, Mira couldn't. Every time she pressed a key and heard the sour, wobbling sound, it felt like a scratch on her brain. It physically hurt her to listen to it. She found herself holding her breath while she played, tensing up her shoulders until they ached, waiting for the next ugly sound to ruin the song. Her mood began to change. The girl who used to hum happily along with the rain stopped humming. She stopped tapping her fingers on her desk at school. She started to withdraw again, realizing that the dream she had held onto for so long was actually a nightmare. She felt like a pilot who had finally been given a plane, only to find out the wings were made of lead and the engine was broken. The situation got worse because of the neighbors. The walls in the apartment building were paper thin. You could hear the neighbor 2 doors down sneeze. So when Mira started playing the piano, everyone heard it. Unfortunately, because the mechanism was broken, the piano made a lot of noise that wasn't musical at all. Every time she hit a bass note, a loud wooden bang would rattle through the floorboards. When she tried to play faster, the keys clacked together like a typewriter on steroids. One Tuesday evening, about a month after the piano arrived, Mira was trying to practice a difficult exercise that required jumping her hand from the low end to the high end. She was getting frustrated, hitting the keys harder and harder, trying to force them to cooperate. Suddenly, there was a loud, aggressive banging on the front door. Mira froze. Her hands hovered over the keys, her heart pounding. Her mother went to the door and opened it. It was Mrs. Rossi from the apartment next door. Mrs. Rossi was an older woman who usually kept to herself. But tonight she looked furious. "I'm trying to watch my television shows," Mrs. Rossi shouted, her voice sharp enough to cut through the thin walls. "And I am trying to put my grandbaby to sleep. All day long, bang, bang, bang. It sounds like someone is breaking furniture in there, not playing music. It is terrible. Make it stop." Mira's face turned bright red. She slumped over the keys, pressing her forehead against the cool, dusty wood of the piano. She wanted to disappear. She wanted the floor to open up and swallow her whole. Her mother apologized profusely, closing the door quietly, but the damage was done. The silence in the room afterward was heavy and suffocating. Her father looked at Mira, his face full of concern. Maybe we should sell it, Mira, or give it back. It is causing too much trouble." Mira shook her head, tears stinging her eyes. She didn't want to give it back, because giving it back meant giving up on being a musician. But she couldn't keep going like this either. She felt trapped. She stood up abruptly, the bench scraping loudly against the floor, and stormed into her bedroom, slamming the door. She didn't come out for dinner. She lay in bed, listening to the silence, hating the piano, hating the apartment, and hating her own hands for not being good enough to tame the beast in the living room. For 3 days, Mira didn't touch the piano. She came home from school, ignored her parents' worried glances, and went straight to her room. The piano sat in the corner, covered in a thin layer of new dust, a monument to her failure. On the 4th day, there was a knock at the door. It was Mr. Vance. He had heard from the principal that Mira had stopped attending her after-school music sessions, and he was worried. He came into the living room holding his hat in his hands and looked at the silent piano. Then he looked at Mira, who was sitting on the sofa with her arms crossed, staring at the floor. "So," Mr. Vance said softly, "the honeymoon period is over, is it?" Mira shrugged, not looking up. "It's broken," she muttered. "Mrs. Rossi hates it. My hands hurt. It sounds terrible. I can't learn on this. I'm not a pianist." Mr. Vance walked over to the piano. He sat down on the wobbly bench. He didn't open the keyboard cover immediately. He just sat there, looking at the peeling wood. "You know, Mira, when I was a boy, my father made me a baseball bat out of a tree branch. It wasn't straight. It was heavy. It didn't feel like the bats the other kids had." Mira looked up, interested despite herself. "Did you break it?" "I wanted to," Mr. Vance said with a chuckle. "I tried to swing it like a normal bat, and it twisted in my hands. I missed every ball. I was angry. But then my father told me something. He said, 'The tree didn't grow straight for you. You have to change your swing to match the branch.'" Mr. Vance lifted the keyboard cover. He placed his hands on the keys. He didn't try to play a pretty song. He pressed the sticky middle C key, listening to the dull thud. He pressed it again, harder, and found that if he hit it a certain way, it made a percussive sound, almost like a drum. He tried the buzzing D note. Instead of trying to hide the buzz, he played it loudly, letting the metallic vibration ring out. "You are trying to tame this piano," Mr. Vance said, turning to look at her. "You are trying to force it to sound like the pianos in the concert hall. You want it to be something it is not. You are fighting the instrument, and the instrument is winning." "How am I supposed to play it if I don't fix it?" Mira asked, her voice trembling. "It's garbage. It is not garbage," Mr. Vance said firmly. "It is unique. Look at this key," pointed to the one that buzzed. "A normal piano wants to sing. This one wants to growl. A normal piano is smooth. This one is rough. Stop trying to make it pretty. Make it interesting. Don't try to tame the beast, Mira. Learn to speak its language." He leaned in and played a simple rhythm, but he used the broken keys to his advantage. He hit the sticky key with his palm instead of his finger, turning the mistake into a beat. He used the buzzing high notes to add tension. It wasn't a classical piece anymore. It sounded primitive, raw, and surprisingly catchy. Mira watched his hands closely. She saw that he wasn't fighting the resistance of the keys. He was using the resistance. He was leaning into the heavy weight of the action. He was accepting the flaws. The piano is a tool, Mr. Vance said, stopping and looking at her intensely. If a hammer's broken, you don't throw it away if it's the only one you have. You learn how to hit the nail differently. That is what separates a good musician from a great one. A great musician can make music out of anything. Even this. He stood up and patted the top of the dusty piano. Don't apologize for the noise, Mira. Don't apologize for Mrs. Rossi. Find the sound that this specific piano wants to make, and make that sound. Mr. Vance left a short while later, leaving the house quiet once again. But the air had changed. Mira sat on the sofa for a long time, looking at the piano. It was still ugly. It was still broken. But for the first time, she didn't see it as an enemy that needed to be fixed. She saw it as a challenge. She stood up slowly and walked toward the keyboard. She didn't sit down yet. She just stood there, listening to the sounds of the city outside. And then she looked at the chipped, yellowed keys, wondering what language they were speaking and if she was brave enough to learn it. For a long time after Mr. Vance left, the apartment was perfectly quiet. Mira sat on the sofa, just staring at the piano. It looked the same as it had that morning, large, dusty, and crooked. But something inside Mira had shifted. She wasn't looking at it as a broken machine anymore. She was looking at it as a mystery she needed to solve. She stood up and walked over to the bench. But she didn't sit down immediately. She remembered what Mr. Vance had said about the baseball bat. She had been trying to swing this bat like it was straight and smooth, but it was crooked and heavy. She had to change her swing. Mira sat down and took a deep breath. She cracked her knuckles, a habit she had picked up recently, and placed her hands on the keys. Usually she would start with a scale, trying to be precise. But not tonight. Tonight, she wanted to understand the beast. She started with the worst offender, the middle C key. She pressed it gently. Nothing. She pressed it a bit harder. Still nothing but a mushy feeling. She frowned, watching the key. It was stuck because the felt inside was swollen from the water damage. Mr. Vance hadn't tried to fix it. He had used it like a drum. Mira curled her hand into a loose fist and gave the key. A sharp tap with the side of her thumb. Thud. It wasn't a musical note. It was a percussive sound, like a heartbeat. She did it again. Thud. Then she tapped the key next to it, which worked fine. She began to tap a rhythm. Thud-tap-thud-tap. It sounded like a drum beat from a rock song. For the first time, the silence of the apartment wasn't filled with failure. It was filled with a beat. Next, she moved her hand to the upper register, the high notes. She knew that the E key buzzed horribly. It sounded like an angry bee trapped in a jar. Usually she avoided playing it. But now, she pressed it down hard and didn't let go. The metal strings inside vibrated against the wood, creating a harsh, rattling sound. It was ugly, but it was also interesting. It sounded tense. It sounded like danger. Mira started to experiment. She played a low bass note with her left hand. It was a muddy, unclear sound, almost like a growl. While that note was ringing out, she tapped the buzzing E key with her right hand. The growl and the buzz mixed together. It sounded like the noise from the street outside, the sound of the city she lived in. It wasn't pretty classical music. It was raw and gritty. It felt real. Over the next few weeks, Mira's practice sessions changed completely. She stopped trying to play the songs in her beginner book. Those songs were written for perfect pianos, and they sounded terrible on hers. Instead, she started writing her own music in her head. She would walk to school, listening to the rhythm of the jackhammers on the construction site, and she would think, I can do that on the broken bass keys. She would hear a car alarm, a rising and falling siren, and she would think, that is the high D and E keys. The piano was still difficult to play. Physically, it was a workout. The action was so heavy that her fingers and forearms ached every night. Because the springs were rusted, the keys didn't bounce back up quickly. Mira had to actively lift her fingers with force every time she played a note. It was like lifting weights at the gym. But Mira didn't mind the pain anymore. She saw it as conditioning. She knew that if she could get her fingers strong enough to master this heavy keyboard, playing a normal piano someday would feel like pushing feathers. She also developed a strange kind of relationship with the sticky keys. She learned exactly how much pressure to apply to the stuck C key to make it speak, or if it was in a mood to stay silent. It was almost like the piano had a personality. Sometimes, when it was humid, the keys were slower. Sometimes, when it was dry, the buzzing got louder. Mira learned to check the weather before she played, adjusting her touch to match the mood of the wood and steel. One rainy afternoon, Mira was sitting at the piano, completely lost in the music. She was playing a slow, bluesy melody she had invented. She was using the pedal, even though it squeaked, to hold down the bass notes while she played fast, sharp rhythms on the stuck keys. She wasn't thinking about what she was doing. She was just feeling it. Her eyes were closed and her head was bobbing slightly to the rhythm she was creating. Suddenly, she realized she wasn't alone. Her mother was standing in the doorway holding a basket of laundry. She was watching Mira with a look of pure amazement. Mira stopped playing, her hands hovering over the keys, feeling shy again. "Don't stop," her mother said softly. "I didn't know it could sound like that." "It's still broken, Mom," Mira said, looking down at the chipped ivory. "I just learned how to work around it." "It doesn't sound broken," her mother said, walking into the room and putting the basket down. "It sounds strong. It sounds like you." That was the moment Mira truly understood. The music she was making wasn't about perfection. It was about overcoming. A perfect piano played a perfect note, and that note was pleasant, but it didn't have a story. Her piano, this ruined, water-damaged beast, had to fight to make a sound. Every note was a struggle, and because of that struggle, the music had depth. It had emotion. It had a soul. Mira turned back to the keys. She didn't feel the dread she used to feel. She felt a connection. She placed her hands back on the keyboard and started playing again. She played a melody that weaved in and out of the broken notes, using the buzz as an accent and the thud as a foundation. She was no longer wishing for a shiny black piano from the shop window. She realized that if she had been given that perfect piano, she would have learned to play notes, but she wouldn't have learned to make music. She wouldn't have learned to listen to the silence between the notes, or to find beauty in the noise. She played until the sun went down and the room was dark. Her fingers were sore, her wrists were tired, but her heart was full. The worst piano in the city was no longer her enemy. It was her partner. And together, they were making a sound that no one else in the world could make. The day of the regional youth recital arrived faster than Mira expected. One morning, she was struggling with a sticky key in her living room, and the next, she was standing in the wings of a massive auditorium, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The hall was nothing like her dusty apartment or the cramped school gym. It was a grand place with high ceilings, velvet curtains, and a stage that seemed to stretch on forever. The air smelled of floor wax and expensive perfume, a sharp contrast to the damp mildew smell she was used to. Backstage, Mira peeked through the heavy red curtains. The auditorium was filling up with people, parents in nice clothes, judges with clipboards, and other students who looked like they belonged in magazines. Many of them were warming up their fingers, looking nervous but confident. Mira looked down at her own hands. They were strong, the fingertips calloused from months of wrestling with heavy, rusted action. But they looked small and plain compared to the polished perfection of everything else around her. Then she saw the piano. It sat in the center of the stage, gleaming under the bright spotlights. It was a brand new concert grand, shiny and black as a pool of oil. It looked perfect. There were no chips in the keys, no missing legs, and no dust. It looked like a spaceship compared to the old tractor she had at home. A wave of panic washed over her. Mr. Vance had warned her about this moment, but seeing it was different than imagining it. This piano was going to be incredibly responsive. The keys would press down with the slightest touch, unlike the heavy weights she fought with every day. What if her fingers were too rough? What if she was so used to forcing sound out of a broken instrument that she broke this delicate one? "You look like you're about to face a firing squad," a voice said beside her. Mira jumped. It was Mr. Vance. He was wearing a suit that looked a little too big for him, and he had a proud smile on his face. "Relax, Mira. Remember what we talked about?" The music isn't in the machine. It's in you. Clean, Mira whispered, looking back at the stage. What if I can't control it? Mr. Vance chuckled softly. You learn to dance on a tightrope, Mira. Walking on a flat floor is going to feel easy. Just trust your hands. They know what to do. One by one, the other students went out to play. Mira watched and listened. The first girl played a fast, complicated piece by Mozart. Her fingers flew across the keys, and she didn't make a single mistake. It was perfect, technically. But as Mira listened, she realized it was also empty. It sounded like a computer typing out notes. The girl was concentrating so hard on not making mistakes that she forgot to tell a story. The next boy played a loud, dramatic piece. He hit the keys hard, trying to show off, but on such a responsive piano, it just sounded harsh and banging. The audience clapped politely, but Mira could see the judges looking bored. Then the announcer called her name. Next, we have Mira Sharma. Mira took a deep breath, straightened her simple blue dress, and walked out onto the stage. The lights were blinding, so she couldn't see the audience clearly, but she could feel them. Hundreds of eyes watching her. She walked up to the gleaming piano and sat down on the bench. It didn't wobble. It was solid and stable. She reached out and touched the keys. They were smooth and cool, and when she pressed them gently, they sang out a pure, clear sound. It felt effortless. It felt like cheating. For a second, she missed the gritty resistance of her old piano. She missed the fight. But then she closed her eyes. She pictured her living room. She pictured the chipped ivory and the buzzing strings. She remembered the lesson Mr. Vance taught her. Don't just play the notes. Play the emotion. She started to play. She had chosen a piece that was difficult, full of deep bass notes and soaring high melodies. As her fingers struck the keys, she didn't hold back, because she had spent months building up strength to press down the heavy, rusted keys of her wrecked piano. Her fingers were now incredibly powerful. She hit the keys of the grand piano with a confidence that shocked even herself. The sound wasn't harsh. It was rich and full. The piano seemed to wake up under her hands. The bass notes rumbled like thunder, just like she intended, and the high notes sparkled like crystal. But it wasn't just about power, because Mira had learned to listen so carefully to find the music in the noise of her bad piano. She had developed an incredible ear for tone. She knew exactly how long to hold a note to make it fade into silence beautifully. She knew how to press a key to make it sound sad, and how to strike it to make it sound angry. She wasn't just playing the notes on the page. She was pouring all her frustration, all her hard work, and all her hope into the music. The piece had a section that was very fast and complicated. This was where many students stumbled. But Mira's fingers flew. They had been trained by the uneven, sticky keys of her old piano to be independent and precise. She knew exactly where every finger was going. The music flowed out of her like a river, washing over the audience. The buzzing, thumping struggles of the past few months were gone, replaced by a melody that was soaring and free. She was playing for herself, for her parents, and even for Mrs. Rossi next door, who had complained about the noise, but who would surely have appreciated this sound as she reached the climax of the song. She played a series of loud, crashing chords that echoed through the hall. Then, in a split second, she pulled back to a whisper-soft note. The contrast was breathtaking. The hall went completely silent. You could hear a pin drop. Mira held that final note, letting it ring out until it faded into nothingness. She lifted her hands off the keys and opened her eyes. For a second, there was total silence. Mira felt a flash of panic. Did she mess up? But then the applause exploded. It wasn't just polite clapping. It was a roar. People were standing up. Mr. Vance was clapping the loudest, a huge grin on his face. Mira stood up and bowed, her face flushing hot. She felt light, like she was floating. Backstage, the other students looked at her differently now. They weren't looking at the girl from the poor neighborhood. They were looking at a musician. When the judges posted the results, Mira's name was at the very top. First prize. On the car ride home, the trophy sat on her lap, shining gold. Her parents couldn't stop talking about it. Her father kept stopping at red lights just to turn around and look at her with tears in his eyes. "You did it, Beta," he said. "You really did it." When they finally pulled up to their apartment building, the familiar smells of the city greeted them again. It was noisy, and the streets were dirty, but it felt like home. They carried the trophy upstairs, past Mrs. Rossi's door, and into their small living room. There in the corner sat the old, dusty, upright piano. It looked sad and lonely compared to the shiny trophy. It looked like a piece of junk. Her mother looked at it, then at the trophy. Maybe her mother said hesitantly, "Now that you won, we can get rid of this old thing. Maybe we can try to buy a better one, a little at a time." Mira looked at the broken piano. She walked over to it and ran her hand along the chipped wood. She thought about the sticky C key and the buzzing. She thought about the blisters on her fingers and the anger she had felt. If she had been given a perfect piano from the start, she never would have won today. She would have played perfectly like the first girl, but with no soul. The struggle had made her strong. "No," Mira said softly. "I want to keep it." Her parents looked surprised. "But it's so broken, Mira. It's so hard to play," her father said. Mira smiled and sat down on the wobbly bench. She pressed the middle C key. It didn't make a sound. It just stuck there, mushy and silent. She laughed. She knew exactly how hard to hit it to make it work. She leaned over and whispered to the old instrument, "You taught me how to fly." She turned back to her parents. "This one is my teacher." The shiny piano on stage was just for show. The real music happened right here. Mira placed her trophy on top of the dusty piano. It looked a little silly, a bright gold trophy sitting on a pile of scratched wood, but it felt right. She opened the fallboard, revealing the jagged yellowing keys, and began to play. The sound was rough and uneven, but to Mira, it was the most beautiful sound in the world. It was the sound of victory.